Hello, everybody. Welcome to our discussion. Today, we're going to talk about the duty to contribute. I think everybody, no matter what country they live in, where they live, has a duty to contribute to society in general, to advance the interests of not only themselves, but the people that they live with and live for. That's the intention of this discussion. First, we'll start with a great quote from Frederick Douglass. We'll learn more about him in a little bit. Great person, a great life, and a great legacy. But he said at one time, people might not get all they work for in this world, but they certainly work for all they get. The importance of work, the duty to work, one of the four aspects that make up this contribution that we think that we should offer to the generation we live and the generation that comes after us. My dad used to talk about that you have to sing for your dinner. What he meant was you have to work for what you get. There was a family that lived down the street from us, and they, like us, were farmers. And when their children used to put their feet under the table for dinner, their parents used to say, that dinner is your pay. So in other words, they worked in the fields for their dinner. I was a bit lucky. Our parents paid us because they felt we should get something for the work that we're doing. But it's all the same concept about you have to working for your dinner. Along with this work aspect and this duty that we have to contribute, it reminds me that we all have to give more than we take. We have to pay more than we cost. So for like Social Security or Medicare or any other benefit that we receive from somewhere, someplace, we have to pay something into that so that we can then have a benefit as well. We have to produce more than we consume. We can't just take all the products or services that we have. We also have to add to that reservoir of products and services that others may take. We have to save more than we spend. Again, my dad said at one time, it's not what you make, it's what you spend that determines your wealth. So there's quite a few people that never made much money, but they're quite wealthy because they saved whatever they made. And then you have to work more than you play. Play is important. We all enjoy the aspect of playing. But in order to play, you need to have accomplished some work and made some living, had some accomplishments that allowed you some time off and some money in order to enjoy the play that you had. The more that you play and the more that we see people play, we hope that they've also had to work more, longer, harder, whatever it may be. The greater you work, hopefully, the greater you can play. Remember Frederick Douglass? Here's the story I wanted to share with you about Frederick Douglass. He was the first African American to receive a vote for president. It happened about 150 years ago at the Republican Convention. Frederick was born into slavery. His boss's wife taught him the alphabet, very rare during that time, and he learned to love education. He then used his spectacular oratory skills and his renowned written skills to highlight the fallacies and morality of subjugating an entire people to the will of others. How successful was Frederick Douglass? He opened an African-American school in Baltimore, served as president of a bank, and even met Abraham Lincoln. He lobbied Abraham Lincoln to secure fair pay for black soldiers. What an accomplishment. He certainly defined a generation and inspired those in another. He once said, "We may explain success with one word, and that word is work." That's how important he felt work was. He felt if you can work, you can be just about anything you want. No, it wouldn't be easy, and there'd be many barriers and challenges that would encounter you along that road. But if you can work for it, you often can get it. So what are those duties of a citizen? There's four. The duty to work, the duty to participate, the duty to learn, and the duty to contribute. So let's start with the duty to work. How important is the duty to work? Countries don't survive unless people contribute their hard work and effort to the benefit of themselves and others as well. Thankfully, in the United States, we've had a country that largely worked. In 1900, about 55% of people aged 15 to 64 worked. That's a great percentage. And when you think that back in 1900, the average age of a person dying was less than 65. And given that there wasn't a great prevalence of medicines and healthcare, people as they aged also became more ill. They certainly didn't have the level of health that we have today. So when you think that 55% of people work, that's quite high. In 2023, it was about 60%, so it went up a little. But there's a couple of voids within that percentage. Of course, many more people go to school than in 1900. In fact, as we'll learn, about 55 million go through K through 12 and another 20 million go to college. So those people would not be included in these numbers of the percent working. And the highlight of the last century in terms of the percentage of people working was in the 2000, about 67% of people worked. Why so high? There was a much younger population during that time, and there was more women entering the workplace. One statistic about education, it may be advantageous to highlight. In 1900, only about 11% of children were in high school. In the 2000s, about 87% of people actually graduated high school. You can see the differences in why the percentages are what they are today. Certainly, there's differences the way we work. There's more part-time work than there is full-time work today, and there's more consultants and contractors. But we definitely come from a working country. In fact, many other countries have a high percentage of people working too. But it remains a duty. The primary duty, I think. I once wrote that the primary duty of a citizen is to find gainful, productive work that in some way and in some place allows a country to meet its commitments. Everybody needs to contribute their efforts, their talents, skills, knowledges, whatever it is that they have, to the betterment of the people with them in their generation and in the next generation. And it's because people work that countries work. Some design the buildings and others construct them. Some grow the food and others make the food. Some sweep the streets and others patrol the streets. But without the teacher and the poet, the doctor and the housekeeper, the engineer and the garbage man, a humanitarian would be less human, and a civilized people would be less civilized. And besides education, work is the only way a person can advance their position or status. I've often said that if you work hard, you'll be a success. It may not be in what you want, but you will be a success. And it reminds me of Ray Kroc. Most people don't remember the name Ray Kroc, but as soon as I start telling you his story, you'll know right away. 2 million people work in one of his 40,000 restaurants. He serves 70 million people a day in over 120 countries. Obviously, McDonald's. His story is quite inspiring. He was a high school dropout. He sold paper cups to restaurants, and he saw a milkshake machine in one of the restaurants. He soon sold these milkshake machines, and during one call, he met the McDonald brothers, who owned a hamburger restaurant. They had a simple menu and great customer service. He saw an opportunity, and he convinced the brothers to let them franchise the restaurant. 6 years later, he bought the entire business, more than 100 restaurants at the time. He focused on familiar foods, good prices, and standardization. He virtually invented franchise restaurants. He wrote an autobiography and he called it Grinding It Out, the Making of McDonald's. He recognized that he made it through hard work and determination, but also a little bit of luck. In fact, he once said, luck is a dividend of sweat. The more you sweat, the luckier you get. It reminds me of a statement by one of the founders of this country who said, the harder I work, the luckier I get. Luck, yes, but you have to put yourself in a position to take advantage of it. Second, the duty to participate. You have to participate in the governance of the country in which you live. There's many different ways that you can participate. I'll highlight two. Voting and taxes. Everybody can vote, and everybody should pay taxes. These are rudimentary requirements of anyone living in a country. So let's first talk about voting. The United States has had a horrific history of voting. Who knows why we didn't allow certain people the ability to vote? When the country was founded and all were seen as equal, they really weren't under the law. In fact, it wasn't until 1870 that non-whites were allowed to vote. And it wasn't until 1919 that women were allowed to vote. The Voting Rights Act, which was about 60 years later, eliminated poll taxes and literacy tests that were seen as barriers for certain people to vote. But what's interesting is between 1840 and 1900, about 80% of those eligible to vote actually voted. And in 2020, only 66% of those eligible voted. So even though we've made voting easier, fewer people are voting. Quite interesting. And in fact, the 2020 election was one of the high points in terms of percentages of voting. Most of the 19th or the 20th century, we've seen a decline in voting. So that's the first aspect of participation voting. The second is taxes. We should be glad that we pay taxes because taxes help support a country and its people. Now, of course, you can ask yourself if the money is spent wisely, and there's great debate on that. But there shouldn't be a debate that we should pay for the common use of the land upon which we live. But we don't pay fairly, and in ways that most people would not imagine is fair or unfair. In fact, 40% of all the households in the United States pay no income tax. They don't contribute income tax to the general welfare of the United States. And in fact, the top 1% in terms of income, they make about 22% of all the income in the United States, but they pay about 43% of all federal income taxes. So they make 22%, but pay about double that rate in federal income taxes. When you look at the top 10%, they make about 50% of all the income, but that top 10% pays about 75%, 3/4 of all federal income taxes. In some ways, people would think that's unfair. I'd also think it's unfair that although we collect $5 trillion in federal income taxes a year, there's another $1 trillion in taxes that is not collected. That's not reported on as income on federal income tax, and therefore it's not collected. That's 20% of all income. Can you imagine what we could do with those monies if we were to collect them on an annual basis? The duty to participate. What's interesting about the duty to participate is the country wasn't necessarily founded as a participatory country. In fact, people lived an isolated existence. They worked in a family farm. There was few social clubs to join. There were really no schools to attend. In fact, it took 10 months to ratify the Constitution. People wanted independence from their government, and they wanted a Bill of Rights to guarantee certain rights. But by the 1870s, something happened called the Industrial Revolution, and that virtually invented a different type of society. We created factories and organizations, cities and communities. People moved from their farms to the cities. In fact, just between 1800 and 1850, there was 5 times more people in the United States. Can you imagine a country that has grown 5 times in just 50 years, from 5 million to 23? Unbelievable. There was a need for railroads and education, businesses, and yes, organizational laws. Quite interesting. This started a dramatic rise in government and also the need for taxes. And as government got larger, there was more at stake. There wasn't this great need to have debates and arguments about government when they were such a small percentage of the economy. In fact, in 1900, the government was only about 10% of the U.S. economy. Today, it's anywhere from 35 to 40%. When the government has more money and spends more money, then there's great consideration on who they spend that money on. So it's important that we vote because there's more at stake, and it's important that we pay for what we have. Thomas Jefferson said once, "We don't have government by the majority. We have government by the majority who participate." That's why it's important to vote, to make sure that your voice is heard and that you have, at least in some way and in some manner, you are contributing to the governance of the country in which you live. I once wrote that what's confounding is how people are so revolutionary and so enlightened in some areas of humanity, yet also so vicious and horrific in others. The answer may never be known. But what's interesting is these same people taught the next generation to do better and to be better. All too slowly, we now live in the most progressive era in history, where centuries ago, some inhabitants were terrifyingly violent, and decades ago, some people were appallingly racist. Today, those numbers are far fewer, and those people are far better. That is the result of people who vote to make a difference in this country and contribute their funds to help move economically, societally, and also politically in the areas that treat people just a bit better and just a bit humanely. How about the third one, the duty to learn? I believe we have a duty to learn as people. Why? It's because learning and education allows us to do two things. First is to gain the basic knowledge and skills needed to live in this changing and dynamic place. And second, education showcases the possibilities that exist in the world of today and the opportunities that can be created in the world of tomorrow. That's why today 55 million children are in K through 12 education, and about 20 million more are in college. That's a hefty percentage. We spend about $15,000 per child, K through 12, in education, or a total of about $800 billion. Far cry from 1840, when about 55% of people attended primary school, a very low percentage. Thomas Jefferson again made a statement about education in this regard, and he said, "Self-government is not possible unless the citizens are educated sufficiently to enable them to exercise oversight." That is one of the reasons learning is so important. And learning is so important because of the lessons we've learned from Helen Keller. An unknown illness caused a 19-month-old Helen Keller to lose her sight and hearing, leading to an unruly childhood until she met a person by the name of Anne Sullivan. Anne became a towering influence in Helen's life, teaching her to read and write by drawing letters in her hand of each object she touched, from water to dolls. Shortly thereafter, she learned to speak. She became the first deaf and blind person to graduate from college, Harvard, in fact, but is remembered more for what she did with her education. She co-founded the American Civil Liberties Union. Most people don't know that. And through her books and speeches, she highlighted the challenges and opportunities for the deaf and blind. She was so influential that a biography of hers, The Miracle Worker, won the Pulitzer Prize. And the actress who played her, by the name of Patty Duke-Austin, in the film called The Miracle Worker, won the Academy Award. Helen was a true American hero who recognized the value of everyone, not just the disabled. In fact, Mark Twain once said that the two most interesting characters were Helen Keller and Napoleon. I also wrote, in regards to education once, that through the best of education, students have the opportunity to become a more moral, spiritual, and philosophical person. One who can then use this knowledge to make a more reasoned and rational decision. One that is not selfish or self-interested, but rather more balanced and fair, more attuned to the influences of goodness, decency, and honor. Education allows someone to be more good, more decent, and more honorable. Duty to contribute, the very last, the title of the presentation. We have participants that vote and contributors who campaign. We have participants who work and contributors who lead. We have participants who sit in the stands and contributors who play on the field. In actuality and in practice, we need both. Without votes, no candidate's elected. Without employees, no manager is needed. And without fans, no superstars are idolized. I've long believed that each person is given something, anything, that is different than someone else. And that difference is what makes them a spectator in one sport and a player in another. It reminds me of three people who contributed in history. Beethoven, who may have been the greatest composer who ever lived. In fact, he wrote over 700 works of music, all while losing his hearing. Pretty remarkable. Then there's Gutenberg. He was the founder of the printing press in the 1400s. That sent research to inventors, chemists, and engineers. And possibly this is seen as the greatest invention in history because of all of the knowledge that it allowed to be disseminated throughout the world. And speaking of great people, Martin Luther King. He pioneered the way in which a people should struggle and overcome any disadvantages or racist attitudes that may occur in society. Hopefully, in the prospective eras of our time, no people are treated as Martin Luther King's people were treated. But if they are, unfortunately, they can follow his model. He once said, the only morally and practically sound method open to oppressed people is their struggle for freedom. They must struggle for freedom. And he followed Gandhi's philosophy, and he made it universal, which is peaceful nonviolence. And his example is one reason why there's a national holiday in the United States for Martin Luther King, and his name still resonates in just about any hall of justice or injustice throughout this country and throughout the world. And that does remind me, when we speak of people who contribute, of Betty Davis. Kind of an interesting person, but I hope after telling you the story about Betty Davis, you'll be convinced why. She has 10 Academy Award Best Actress nominations, third in history. She has 2 Academy Awards. She's truly a historical figure in her industry. She had talent, she had drive, but it was not an easy path for Betty Davis. Her dad once said that she was unimportant, which could have paralyzed somebody else, but for her, she decided to conquer the world, as she said in one of her autobiographies. From then on, almost until she died, Betty Davis learned, worked, prevailed, conquered, and contributed to her industry. She studied the craft of movie making and battled the powerful studio heads like Warner Brothers studio chief Jack Warner. She wanted better parts. He refused, so she went to England. He sued. She lost. She later said, "I'm a woman. I was told I had no right to fight like a man." But fight she did. She stood her ground. She learned, worked, contributed right up until the end. She had something to say and something to do, and we're grateful that she shared both with us. Interesting postscript. After she died, on her memorial, she wanted this said: she did it the hard way. She did do it the hard way. Great sacrifice, but also great accomplishments. And in terms of contribution, I would say this. The hope is that we all use those traits and characteristics, talents and capabilities that make us unique and interesting, fascinating and intriguing, so that at one point and in some place, we become the contributor rather than the participant. That may not happen today or tomorrow, but maybe someday soon. Too many wait too long to contribute, and that's a true shame. And there's also another story that reminds me of the importance of contributing. Because back in 1776, there was a small group of determined individuals who wanted something safer and freer, one that offered more promise in the coming years than the debilitating misery offered in the past. That was at least the belief and hope, which once realized necessitated a continued sense of sacrifice and adventure, but an inspired yet unknowing populace that would follow them to make sure that this came true. They believed, in totality, that each of them had a duty to work, and this duty to work was paramount to any other effort. And they also had other responsibilities: to participate in voting, a duty to learn so that they can add to the value of knowledge, both within that generation and subsequent generations. And then they also had this duty to contribute their own talents and to create something different, maybe even something better. That is what creates a country and creates a home, most importantly. A couple other points. I hope that we all learn what we can, share what we know, and contribute to something good. What is that something good? It's just something better than exists today. Whether it's a better park, a better street, a better school, or a better job. I think if we can move towards seeing a future that is brighter and better, and then contributing something, anything towards that, when we look back, we'll have a sense of pride and a sense of accomplishment in what we stood for and what we hope to accomplish. Thanks, everybody. Enjoy the day.